Hello, welcome to this video on Filr administration with an in-depth look at LDAP. In this video we'll just have a look at the principles behind LDAP, how to configure it, and some tips and tricks on how to make it work better for you. So first of all, let's just go through why do you need LDAP. Most probably the main thing is that you already have all your users in a directory. This may be AD, it may be eDirectory, and so why create them all over again if we can bring them in from that directory? It gives you a single point of administration for those users. If you change something in your LDAP directory, it will change in Filr. Makes life a lot easier. The other thing is that users can authenticate to Filr using their existing credentials, so they don't have to have a second password that they're using in Filr. If you're going to be implementing the entitlement for multi-factor authentication that you get with Filr Advanced, this is the Advanced Authentication Limited that is a free entitlement, then you can only use that if you've got LDAP users. Your internal users can't use that. That gives you additional methods of authentication such as SMS one-time password, email one-time password, time-based one-time password that you can be prompted for when authenticating to Filr, and to use that you need to have your users in an LDAP directory. If you're going to be using local users, so these are users that are internal to Filr and aren't in a LDAP directory, then you don't need to obviously set up LDAP, but there is one setting on there which is set by default, which we'll see later on, which you just need to make sure that you have got enabled, otherwise your users won't be able to authenticate. So within Filr we've got a number of different types of users. You've got LDAP users. These are users that you've imported from either Active Directory or eDirectory, and users will be authenticated against the directory using their password that's stored in there. You can also have local users, so these are users that have been created locally on the Filr appliance and the Filr system. You manage them within Filr, and because these users don't exist on the existing Windows or OES environment, normally you're going to have to give them personal storage so that they've got somewhere to put files and share those files from. We then have external users, so these are users that have been created by your LDAP or internal users when they share something with someone outside the organization. So to do that, they just share it with an email address. That external user goes through a self-sign-up process, self-registration, where they put in their name and what they want their password to be, after which they can access the information that's been shared with them. But these users are counted as external users. And finally we have system users. So these are users, there are about 5 or 6 that are in a Filr environment, and these are users that are used by Filr for a number of different tasks. So let's just go and have a look at some of these user types within the administration console. If I just click on users, so here you can see users such as guest, the email posting agent, synchronization agent, file sync agent, and indeed the administrator. They're all system users that are created by the system when you first install it. We have some external users. You can see these two here with the envelope and whose user ID is an email address. Those are external users that have been invited to access information that's been shared with them. And then we have our LDAP users, so these are users that have come in from the LDAP directory. And we also have local users, so you can see this one here is admin user that I've created locally on this system is a local user. So just something to bear in mind is that you need to have licenses for your internal users and indeed your LDAP users. The system users, the 5 or 6 system users, and the external users you don't need to have a license for, but internal users and LDAP users you do. So there are a few things that we need to do before setting up our LDAP. First of all, if there's a firewall between the Filr web appliances that you're using and the LDAP source, then you need to open up port 389 and 636 on those so that those servers can access LDAP. 389 is insecure LDAP, 636 is the secure LDAP port. If you're going to be using secure LDAP, and of course generally it's considered bad form to send passwords unencrypted, so I would generally recommend that you do use secure LDAP. You'll need to have a certificate to do that, and we can export that from the LDAP directory, be it Active Directory or eDirectory, and then you need to import that into the JVM certificate store. We'll be having a look at how to do that later on. Finally, something else that we need is a proxy user. So this is a user that you've got in the directory that has rights to view information on the users you're importing. So that needs to be able to access all the properties that you plan to sync, including the home directory attribute of the user, so that they can access that information and create the users and indeed synchronize information if something changes and bring that through to the filer user. So let's just go into a new server that hasn't got LDAP set up, and we can set up LDAP on there. So if I just go to filer web1.demo.live, I don't want to go through on the admin port there. That should take me through. We'll just log in as admin there, and then just go to the administration console. So down towards the bottom of the administration console, we've got the LDAP option here, and we've got a number of tabs and some options here. So first of all, what we need to do is add our LDAP source. So just click on add there. So let's just talk a little bit about LDAP sources. We can have multiple LDAP servers in there. These could be a mixture of AD, eDirectory, maybe multiple AD sources if you wanted to. So you're not limited to just one AD or eDirectory environment. We can mix and match, which is quite useful if you've got two organizations who need to access the same filer environment, possibly when two organizations have just merged together and you want them to be able to share documents easily between themselves. Something to bear in mind is that when you're adding LDAP servers to this, you don't want to have the same LDAP server twice in there for load balancing or high availability options, because that will cause issues. If you want to have high availability on your LDAP, then use a load balancer and point to the load balancer on the LDAP server screen, and then have that balanced out between multiple LDAP servers on the back end. Make sure you don't have the same user in multiple LDAP sources. Again, that can cause issues, and indeed for much the same reason, don't synchronize from the root if you have child AD domains, because if you've got the same user in multiple places, that will cause a problem there. If you're going to be using LDAP-S, secure LDAP, then generally I'd suggest getting it to work on straight LDAP and then switch to secure afterwards. Far too often I've had problems where you're not quite sure if it's the authentication that's going wrong or if it's the certificate that you've got the wrong certificate. If you can get it working first of all on unsecure LDAP and then switch to secure, then you know a lot better where issues are, if there are issues there. Something else to bear in mind is that you can change the attributes that are imported into the system. So if you want to bring in the department, for instance, instead of description, then you can populate that through and bring that in as well. So let's just go and set that up in our environment. So on the LDAP server URL here, I'm just going to do LDAP://ad.utopia.microfocus.com, and then the port :389. I'm going to do this insecure for the moment. My user DN, I've created this proxy user, so I need to bring that user through, and this needs to be the fully qualified name of the user. If you can't work out what the fully qualified name is, then just go into your Active Directory users and computers. Just make sure that you've got the advanced features enabled on the view menu, and then just find the user that you wanted. In this case I've got this filer proxy user here. Notice I've got this filer users group that we'll see being used later on. But on the Filr proxy, if I just go into properties and then go to the attribute editor, I can see down here the distinguished name. So if I double click on that, I can then copy that across quite happily, and we can paste that in on the user DN. I then can put in the password, change the directory type, is going to be Active Directory in this instance. I then have the GUID attribute, which I can change, but generally I would leave at the object GUID that we've got there. And similarly for the Filr account name attribute, I'd leave that at SAM account name rather than anything else, but I can change that should I wish to. And then down here, if I wanted to, I can change the mappings. We've got the Filr name there, and then the LDAP name is the second part there, so I can change those mappings to a different LDAP name attribute should I wish to. If I then click on users, the first time I know that we've got the configuration on the server information screen correct is when I come to add in a user search container and I click on the browse. If that comes up and I can see the whole tree, I know that that's correct. In this case, I'm just going to select the London container. We then have a filter of users here, so I can say only bring in users who have this attribute set if I wanted to, that sort of thing. You can see we've got logical ands in here, we've got ors in here as well with the pipe. If you're not quite sure on LDAP filter syntax, there's plenty on the internet that can show you. We might want to import a subset of users into Filr rather than bringing everyone in. So normally this is because you haven't got enough licenses for everyone, or you may still have thousands of users in the directory who've left the organization and you don't want them in Filr, and you don't want to give them licenses because it's going to cost money. So there's a number of ways that we can just bring in some users. You can just set the base DN to a container where your active users are, and then just bring in the users who are in that container. Though typically I tend to prefer to use LDAP filter based on a group. So remember we saw that group earlier of Filr users. I only want to bring in users who are in that group. So if I want to give somebody access to Filr within Active Directory, I just need to add them to that group, and I don't need to do anything in Filr whatsoever. It's all done from the directory. Within eDirectory, I'd use the group membership option. Within Active Directory, it's a member of, and then the fully qualified name of the group. So here I'm just going to change this filter here to the group, and of course I can't remember what the group fully qualified name is, so let's just go back to the Windows server. I've got my group here. Again, if I go into properties, I've got my attribute editor and I've got my full name of that group. So I'm just going to change that component there to be what I just copied. I'm going to say I'm going to search subtrees, so anything that's within the London container that is a member of that group is going to come in. Notice that that group doesn't have to be in the same container as where my users are that I'm importing, so I can separate that out. And then down here I've got my home directory configuration. Let's just talk a little bit about that. So the home directory is the directory that comes in from your Windows server or your Open Enterprise server, which is typically where users have their own space. Usually, more often than not, it's mapped to the H drive, and it's their own personal area where they can put files and store files that are personal to them rather than shared with other people. We can typically bring in that home directory and set that up for users based on the attribute that they have within the LDAP directory, and more often than not that's populated and we can bring that in quite happily. Sometimes though that attribute isn't populated, so we can build that up based on existing netfolder servers that we've created and a subdirectory of that, and variables such as %cn or %sam account name for the subfolder of that their home directory is. We can also specify to use an LDAP attribute if you've got it populated in some other attribute that's exposed by LDAP. And of course we can say don't bother creating a home directory if you didn't want, and then users won't even see that option for My Files within the web interface. If you're not bringing it in, then another thing you could do, of course, is give them personal storage, so that's storage on the Filr appliance where they can put their own files if you wanted to. So in this instance, I'm just going to say use the LDAP home directory attribute, though I could say equally as well that I want this on /home /%cn %. So I can also specify, just use that attribute name and put an LDAP attribute in there should I wish to. In this case, I'm just going to use the LDAP home directory attribute that's already in the directory. I can say OK to that, and if I wanted to, I can add additional paths to this to import as well. So I could quite happily just say bring in the Berlin users should I wish to as well at that point. And of course I could reference that group as well again, and then only the members of that that were in the Berlin container that were in that group would be imported as part of that option there. Let me just delete that, and then we have our group options here, and we can add our group options. So something to bear in mind about groups is that you need to bring in all the groups that use a file access on your file system. If you don't import groups that you're using to give file access to particular folders, we're not going to know which users are members of that group, and therefore which users are allowed to see the files in that directory, and by default they won't be able to see the files. And this is one of the main things that we have people, when they're setting up Filr, say that my users can log in as normal onto the Windows server and they can see this file or this directory structure. Within Filr they can't see it, and it's because they haven't imported the groups that were used to give the file access controls. And typically, because people don't know which groups have been used for that over the many years that the file system has been in place, typically you'll want to import all the groups that you have in your system. We can use a filter or use a base DN to limit the imports of those groups, and indeed we can import nested groups if we wanted to. With eDirectory that's done automatically, but with Active Directory you need to use this somewhat odd filter with this unique number in, which means something to the LDAP server to bring in the subgroups there. Something to bear in mind is that if you have got subgroups, you may need to sync a few times to get all the membership across and into the system. So when you get round to doing the sync, just keep doing a sync until there are no further changes that are happening on the import. So let's just go and set this up. So here I'm just going to set the base DN to be the London container. I'll search subtree, I'll bring in all the groups that are in that container, and indeed I can specify other containers as well if I wanted to. And let's just say OK to that. So next we've got some settings that we can configure along the top here. So we then have our user settings, and ideally you want to set these before you do your initial import, because some of these settings are added to the user when you import them. So if you do them later on, they will only affect users from that point onwards that you import. So first of all, we've got an option to register and synchronize the user profiles, which you want to enable both of them. So we want to, any user that's in the directory, we want added to Filr, and any attributes that you've got on that user, if they've changed on subsequent synchronizations, you want those brought across as well. We then come on to the option of what to do with accounts that were in LDAP but are not there now, or not in the sync anymore. So I typically prefer to delete the account and delete the associated workspaces and content, but that's me personally. If you do that, yeah, you'll notice you get a warning saying that it's not recommended. But the reason that I do that is that I just don't want to have to delete a user in Active Directory and then weeks later go through and delete them from the Filr system. Because in theory, even though they're disabled in Filr, you still need to have a license for those users. I by far prefer to actually delete the account automatically and keep it in sync with the AD environment or eDirectory environment. The only thing to bear in mind is that if you're going to be doing some work on LDAP, most probably I'd switch that back to just disable them, because if I make a mistake there and get my filter wrong, I don't want all my users being deleted from the system and then having to recreate them and all the shares not being there and so on. So typically have it during normal life as delete account. If you're working on the directory and the LDAP sync, then disable it for the duration until you're sure that you've got that quite right. The time zone and language settings that we've got there are relevant, something that gets set when the account is created, so when you synchronize the first time for a user. So if you change these halfway through, it's only going to affect users from that point onwards, not the existing users that have come in. Just something to bear in mind is by default it's on GMT. UK users, I notice, quite often don't set it to GMT London, which means they're an hour out during the summer months, but not many people actually notice that they are out. So let's just go through and set some of the, have a look at those. So you can see here we want to check those two there. By default you have it as disable account, but as I said, I prefer to do delete account. You notice here it says Mike Focus recommends that you don't do it, and I'll also delete the associated user workspaces and content. As for the time zone, I'm in GMT London, so I'll just select that, and you can change the locale as necessary to your local language if you wish. And then we have the group settings. So again, you want to register the groups automatically that match and synchronize there, so you can get information. If you change the description, for instance, that will be synchronized. And of course you do want to synchronize the group membership. So as you change that group in the directory, that will come across to Filr. And again, something that I prefer to do is to delete the groups that were in LDAP but have been deleted. Otherwise, again, you're going to have to manually delete them in the future at some point. So here, leave those all checked and check the delete groups that were no longer there. We then have the synchronization schedule. So as far as synchronization is concerned, we obviously want to query the LDAP directory and bring those users across, create them in Filr, and we want to pick up any changes that have happened. So modifications to those users that have been deleted, users that have been added, and bring those changes across to Filr as well. So periodically we want to go and run a sync and check what's changed there. Obviously the first time that you synchronize users, it's going to take longer than standard sync where it's just picking up any deltas that have happened, because it's got to create a lot of users in the directory. And when we're talking time here, it's most probably going to be a minute or two maximum, unless you've got tens of thousands of users in the directory. You need to also think, when do you want to synchronize? Do you want to synchronize once a day? Do you want to synchronize once an hour? And this most probably depends on how often you're adding users. Do you want users to appear quite rapidly so that people can share with them straight away, or don't you mind it being a day later that they appear? So that's something you most probably need to work out for your particular environment. So here I'm going to enable the schedule. I can run it on selected days, but in this instance I will run it every day at midnight, though we can obviously put whatever settings you want in there. And finally, I've got this option, local user accounts, where I've got by default it allows local accounts that users that I've created in the system to authenticate into Filr. So these are users that aren't in LDAP I want to be able to access Filr as a full user. So let's just go and run a sync. So if I go to my LDAP servers, I've got the option here to sync all. I want to save the configuration. You can see there that it's added 89 users and 5 groups and modified 3 of them, and we've got a number of users that have been added there. So let's just do the same for eDirectory server, just so you can see how that's done. So here I'm just going to set the LDAP server up. So that's going to be LDAP : / and then the OES server, which is eDirectory.demo.live : 389. User.dn is going to be cn equals Filr proxy, o equals system, and the password's going to be entered. Directory type is eDirectory, GUID, CN. What I'll do here is let's just say the description is OU, which is the department that's being exposed from there, so you can see how that comes across as well. If we just go to the users, add a new user context, as I said, here is the first time we're going to know we've got the credentials right on the other page. I'm just going to say I want to bring in users from the Utopia container. I could, of course, here put in just to bring in users of a particular group. In this instance, I'm not going to. I'm going to use search subtree, and we'll use the home directory attribute. I'll say OK to that. And as far as groups are concerned, I'll just bring some groups in from that container, and we'll search subtree there. If I say OK and say OK, then we can just run a sync, do a sync all. That will sync both eDirectory and Active Directory. I'll save my configuration, and then you can see it's bringing across 63 users from eDirectory into there as well. I'll just close that down and say OK to that. So if we go and have a look at the users, we've got users in here who have come from eDirectory, and indeed I've got a whole load of users called Filr user, which are the ones that came from Active Directory. So we have both directories contributing to our user list here. So when users authenticate to Filr as an LDAP user, it's going to do a bind on the LDAP source. So you need to ensure that the account isn't disabled on the back end, and indeed doesn't have limited connections. So You know, if you've only limited it to having one connection and somebody's already logged in to the file server through a native account, for instance, then it's not going to be able to authenticate from Filr. When a user first authenticates, their workspace is created and their home drive is populated at that point in the database. Their home drive doesn't get populated until they've authenticated for the first time to Filr. So if you go and look at the user account within Filr, you'll quite often see that they haven't got a home drive in there, and that's because they haven't yet authenticated. Users can authenticate before an LDAP sync has added them to the directory, as long as they match the filter that you've got on the user container there. But of course, if I want to share something with them, I'm not going to be able to share something until they've logged in to create their account, and I'll be able to see them, or they've been synchronized from LDAP. Something else to bear in mind is that if LDAP is unavailable, users can still authenticate to the system if they have already successfully authenticated to LDAP in the past, and that will go against cached credentials that we have in the database, and of course, yes, they are encrypted in there. Those same credentials are used to access the file system, so if they haven't changed their password after logging in for the previous time, then they'll still be able to access files. Obviously, if they've changed their password, you're going to have problems there authenticating as the user, and you'll see some issues occur with that. But we do have this safety mechanism, so if the LDAP server is down, you've got a fallback to using those cached credentials. Something else that can be confusing for users is that if you've brought in all the groups that you have in your system, this may be confusing when they share a file with someone, because along with all the users that are being displayed, they'll have all the groups. And as I said earlier, sometimes I see more groups in a Filr system than they've got users, and consequently that can be a little bit confusing for users. So if you don't want users to be able to see those groups, then you've got a setting on the share and comment settings to disable that. Let me just show you. Down here on the share and comment settings, by default this is enabled, but I can turn that off and save that. So now users aren't going to see all the groups that I've imported when they do a share. But then maybe you need some of those groups to be visible to your users. So something we can do is create a local group which will be visible, and rather having that as a static membership against users that have to keep updating, we can set that as a dynamic group with the same type of filter that we were using when we imported users to populate that group. So let's just show you how we can do that with one group. Within groups, we can see our groups that we've brought in from the directory. I'm just going to create a new group. Let's call this AD Sales, and that's going to be AD Sales as the title, and I can do a description as well there. I could set the group membership as static and then just add users as need be here, but as that changed, I'd need to come in here and change that as well. But what I can do is make it dynamic. So now as the group changes in the directory, in this case Active Directory, it will bring the membership of that group across here. So I only need to manage that group in Active Directory. If I go into edit this group membership, what I need to do now is just point to, we'll use the AD tree, and it's going to be the London container, and the filter is just going to be what we were using before, so that's going to be member of equals, and then the fully qualified name of the group. So in this case it's going to be the sales group that I want to bring across. Let's close off the parenthesis. I want to search the subtree, and I want it to be updated every time there's a normal LDAP synchronization. So if I just test that query, and it's found 18 members of the group, so that's good. So if I just say OK, and OK to that. There's that AD sales group, and that will get populated when I next do a sync, and it will be that one that the users can see when they come to share something. Something else that we can do with groups is use them for security rights. So for instance, if I want to manage who can share internally, who can share externally, but not from within Filr but from within Active Directory or eDirectory, I can create a group there that I add users to, and then that will take effect within the Filr environment. I don't need to come into Filr to add users to be able to share internally, externally, or do other things like using desktop, force them to have a PIN code, enable them to be able to download files, and so on. So the great thing about doing things this way is that you only need to administer those types of things within your directory where you're already doing your user administration. You don't need to come into Filr to actually do that. So let's just show you how that can work. So if I want to have a group that shares externally that I manage from the directory, all I need to do is just use that group, and I've got AD share externally as a group here, and I'm just going to share, say share with external users. So now anyone I want to be able to share with external users, I just add to that group within Active Directory, and they will then get those rights within Filr. So I don't actually need to come into Filr to give those rights. And we can do that with so many things here if I wanted to. So for instance, we could set default for mobile applications as don't let them access Filr. And then I can have a group here, and for instance, let's take the AD sales one. I could have it called mobile users, and here all I need to do is just say allow them to access Filr, and any other options, and these could be done on separate rights and groups as well if I wanted to. So you can see there, all I need to do is just add someone to that group and they'll be able to do what I want there. So you've got quite a bit of granularity there, but the great thing is that you manage that in your normal tool with Active Directory or iManager with eDirectory, and you don't have to do it within Filr at all. So let's just get into exporting certificates. Secure LDAP, which as we said we tend to recommend because it is a bit more security as far as your passwords are concerned. They're not going across the wire in plain text. We need to get your certificates from your LDAP directory. So within iManager, all we need to do is go on to the CA object and export the certificate from there. And let me just show you how that works. So if I go to objects, go onto the security container, and I've got this object here that's the tree name CA. If I just modify that, go to the certificates tab, which is here, and then the certificate I want to export is this one, not the self-signed certificates, but that one there. First of all, if we just check it and then click on validate, that's valid. Then we check it again, click on export. That's a little bit small, that screen. Let's just make it a little bit bigger. So I need to select the certificate, which is going to be the container CA certificate. I don't want to export the private key, and I want to ensure the format is DER. I click next, and then just save the exported certificate, and we'll save that there. So that's that certificate exported from eDirectory. So exporting the certificate from Active Directory is a slightly different method. So you need to go into the MMC and through the Internet Information Services, which you may find that you have to install because I don't think it's installed by default there. You can create the certificate, and then through the certificate add-in you just export it. So let's just go through that. So let's just run MMC. I want to hit Control M for add or remove snap-ins, and so the ones I want to add in here are the certificate snap-in that we can export from, and in this case it's going to be the computer account and it's going to be the local computer. And the other snap-in I want is that Internet Information Service. Just click on OK. So if I click on the Internet Information Services, select the server I want, go to Server Certificates, and then in the menu on the right hand side I've got this option Create Self-Signed Certificate. If I select that, let's just call this AD LDAP, and that's going to be in personal store. I'm going to say OK, and that's created the certificate for me. So now I just need to go to the certificates add-in, go to personal certificates, and we should see that certificate that we just created there. If I right click on that, take the option for all tasks, and then down the bottom I've got the option to export, and then just follow my nose through the wizard. We don't want to export the private key, and we do want it as DR encoded. I'll give it a file name of AD LDAP, and then just click finish, and the export was successful. That actually gets put in the user folder, just in case you can't find it. It's not in the downloads folder, which is where the iManager one will have been put. Let me just find that. I'm in as administrator. Let me just copy that somewhere that I can upload it onto the server. So to import those, let's just go back to our browser, and I need to authenticate on the 9443 port, the virtual administration port. So that's going to be File Up Web 1. Yes, it's going to be that one. Authenticate as VA admin, password, and then I've got this option here for digital certificates. So you most probably came in here and selected the option for web application certificates when you were importing the certificate for your web server. In this instance, we need to put them in this store, the JVM certificate store, which is the default one that comes up. So here I'm just going to do an import of trusted certificate. Certificate file is going to be the certificate in the certs. Let's just take that AD LDAP one, and I'll say OK, and that has gone in there. And notice it said I needed to reboot for it to take effect. And then on this one I'm just going to import the other one, which was the eDirectory certificate. So let's just call this eDir LDAP. I'll say OK to that, and there we go. And if I just go home and then do a reboot of the server, those will take effect. While that's rebooting, let's just go through a few other things. If you've got universal passwords set in eDirectory, then you may have some issues because users will be able to authenticate to Filr with case-insensitive passwords. So the trouble is that if they do that, then when they try to access files on the file server, on the OES server, then they won't be authenticating properly there, and you will find issues there. For instance, they won't be able to upload files. So if you want to prevent users from logging into Filr with an incorrect password there, in case insensitive password, then you need to set eDirectory LDAP to be NMAS aware, and there's a TID that takes you through it. But if you haven't got universal passwords enabled, then you don't need to worry about that, but it's just something to be aware of there. There is logging available for the LDAP components of Filr. You can set the log level. There's a configuration file, the log4j properties file, which you've got here, and there's some, if you just do a search for LDAP in there, you'll see the LDAP bits. There's some bits for LDAP authentication, the LDAP browsing, and indeed the LDAP sync that you can uncomment and get the logging in the app server log file. So if you're trying to do some troubleshooting, then you may want to just uncomment those log lines and set the log level. By default on the commented lines at the moment it's set to debug, but it is quite useful for troubleshooting if need be. So let's just show you that. Got the log4j properties here, and if I just do a search here for LDAP, you can see here the options for tracing authentications. Here's the option for import and sync. So all I'd need to do if I was having issues with the LDAP sync, I could uncomment the comments there, and that would put a lot more information in the log file for me. So let's just check our LDAP-S is working. So let's just go to our LDAP server, and let's change that one to be LDAP-S, and that's going to be on 636. Most probably the easiest way to just check that's working, as I said, was just do a browse here and see if we get through. So that's coming up fine, so we know that LDAP-S is working there. So that's the Active Directory one, and then if we just take the eDirectory one and set that to LDAP-S as well, and 636, go to the users, do add and browse. Okay, so that's gone slightly wrong there. Let's just go back and edit the server. I think maybe I need the IP address there so it's recognized, which is 172.17.2.180. Let's try now. Go to the users, add. Yep, and there we go. So the certificate's working fine there. And if we just do a sync all, save that, we should hopefully get a successful sync. And there we go, no changes. One other thing, after doing a synchronization, you may be prompted to create credentials for some NetFolder servers. These are servers that have been created automatically when you ran the LDAP sync, and it imported these servers from the servers that were being used as users' home directories. So it's created those for you automatically. So hopefully you found this video useful. Thank you for listening.